Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast. My name is Paul Ellis, and I'm your host for these programs about developments in this fast-growing industry. In 2016, the founding partners at Cibus Capital merged their first-hand experience of the impacts of the current food production industry on the planet and its people. By combining their skills in finance and agriculture, they formed the Cibus Funds to invest in more sustainable food systems. Rob Appleby, Cibus Capital's CIO and founder, believes that by identifying companies that are category or local champions with proven track records, a cost advantage, and that pay specific attention to sustainability criteria, Cibus makes investments that will outperform over the next decade. Hello, Rob, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast.
Thank you, Paul. Delight to be here.
Yes, we're really excited to hear more about what you and Cibus are doing. And so let's just dig right in. How does food and agriculture contribute to the health of the environment today and going forward?
Fantastic. Well, let me put this into context, if I may. We at Cibus think that we are undergoing a period of systemic change. And I'll explain what I mean by that by saying that approximately 100 years ago, humankind invented something called the Haber-Bosch process. And this was an invention to create artificial nitrogen, and with that, the ability to produce crops much more effectively than we had done in the past. And what we ended up with was a population that was fatter, healthier, more wealthy over time. But we also ended up with a high input system, one of monoculture, and that had largely an extractive approach. Today, we understand that with food and agriculture in this position, we are seeing some of these, what we call today, externalities. And those externalities go a little bit like this. We as an industry are responsible for 1/3 of the anthropogenic GHG emissions worldwide. We also recognize that we're responsible for 30% of waste between farm and fridge.
Right.
And 28% of the plastics in the ocean end up because of this industry. And biologically speaking, something like 86% of our species are threatened with extinction as a direct result of this high input system. So really, the future of food is coming through channeling capital towards those companies or organizations or individuals that are charting the future of food. And we at Cibus focus on innovative technology to disrupt food production, to increase resource efficiency, and to ensure sustainability.
Rob, when you talk about disrupting food production, the connotation there is a little bit that you're going to interfere with the way it's being done today. Is that correct?
That is correct. And it's not that we're trying to radically change the systems which heretofore have provided calories at the right place, at the right time, and at the right price. We're simply saying that there's a better way to do things. And that is to produce more food with less inputs, and we're producing better food with less of these externalities that we talk about.
Okay.
And that's what we at Cibus are trying to do.
Great. Okay, so the financial and productivity impacts of climate change on the food and agriculture industries are increasing, as you're suggesting, with rising average global temperatures for one thing, and many other reasons that you've mentioned. Can these impacts be mitigated, especially as the Earth's human population continues to grow rapidly?
My view of this is that there are a number of companies, both public and private, that are sleepwalking into these climate change stressors. We at Cibus are beyond arguing if climate change is actually happening. It is, and we all of us share some responsibility for gauging its impacts, mitigating its effects, and adapting our behavior to be better citizens and to produce, in this case, better food. And it's our belief that there are certain technologies which are coming to our attention. They have a market fit, they have commercial traction that simply do things better than we've done in the past. And I can give you one or two examples briefly.
Please do.
So as the world gets warmer, the humidity in the air is increased, and the likelihood of fungal outbreaks on plants is increased. And what we do, and what we've done previously, is take a petrochemical input in the form of a fungicide, and we spray that systemically across our crops, whether it's corn or rust infection, or whether it's a botrytis or a powdery or downy mildew in grapes. And thus far it's been okay, but it does mean that we're producing, again, these externalities, the runoff, whatever residuals remain in our food is being consumed by humankind. And heretofore, we've been okay with that, but perhaps in the future, we're not going to be okay with that as we increase that input. So there's a company, for example, in Norway called Saga Robotics. And this is a company that takes autonomous robots down a row of grapes, for example, and at night they will apply a UV light to those grapes, and it kills powdery mildew. So you're not producing artificial externalities, you're using UV light to stop or prevent this fungal attack. And to my mind, that's just a better way of doing things and will really inform some of the dialogue in future around better food with lower footprint.
I'm going to jump in. Rob, I'm sorry, I've got to interrupt you here because I watched the video of this robot working on your website, and I encourage all of our followers to go check that out. It's really fascinating the way that you're using ultraviolet light to reduce these fungal infections. So please go ahead.
Terrific. And increasingly, I think, as we look at pests, and these pests may be the orange navel worm that affects almonds in, let's say, California. California is responsible for 80% of the world's almonds. And in order to prevent this pest, it's not the moth that we're worried about, it's its caterpillar that eats little holes into the almond and makes it kind of inedible and totally useless. So by spraying, again, systemically, this petrochemical pesticide in this case, we are preventing this insect from producing its caterpillars. We're also affecting things like lacewings and bees and other forms of pollinators so essential for almond production. And the same goes for citrus in Florida or apples in Washington state, each with their own pest problems. And one of the companies I really like is this French company called M2I. It is a company that produces pheromones. And pheromones are simply a compound derived specifically for that pest insect. And it doesn't affect other pollinators. It doesn't go into the watercourse. It doesn't affect humans. And simply put, if you produce this pheromone, the insect is attracted to it. And you might have a trap for that insect, in which case you reduce the numbers significantly. Or you might spray it when the female is ready to produce its chemical pheromone, and the male is attracted to this waft of artificial pheromone. It goes into the discotheque. It sees all these avatar females, has no one to mate with, and hey, bingo, in 24 or 48 hours, this adult male dies naturally. And again, you reduce those pest numbers without the externalities that we're talking about. And these are two examples that I think are really apposite in this situation.
Wow. So how do these kinds of changes and these new technologies represent opportunity for investors? I would imagine they're pretty expensive to put into the farming and agricultural infrastructure, but over the long run, it sounds like they can be productive in other ways.
Yes, I think by looking at food and farming as an asset class, and speaking to investors as we do, it's clear that some of the attractions of this industry are thus. One is a diversification from what they already have in their portfolio. As you buy land, land is no longer being made, and land, generally speaking, around the world appreciates. If you can look at the highest value and best use of that land by sustainable farming, you can be sure that you not only have a land appreciation or a capital appreciation, but you can get the highest and best use of that land and get an operating income. And it is argued that by doing this, you can have an inflation protection. You can look at protecting your portfolio against recession. And I think it's also a hedge against policy and regulation changes, which we're seeing all over the globe and is coming down the pipe with a lot of these regulations speaking to climate change, speaking to adaptation and mitigation. And to that end, I think it's going to be producing very attractive returns, accompanied with long-term secular tailwinds and investors' fiduciary duties to tick the sustainability box. And in some cases, that's a very strong mechanism. And with its low correlation to other asset classes, it's almost an ideal asset class to be considering as a pension fund or an insurance investor or a high net worth family office or group of family offices.
Okay, so it sounds, Rob, like it's important that the average consumer participate in the consumption of the products that are produced with these emerging technologies, especially in the OECD economies, and in supporting, maybe without even realizing it, the investment capital that's put into and the profitability of companies that are working in this part of the agricultural industry. Is that true?
That is also true. One has to be balanced in responding to that by saying that in many parts of the world and in the OECD, especially, there is a cost of living crisis. And with that, one has to be very conscious of price, of quality of the product and its availability. And it goes without saying on the positive side that the average consumer has had a marked influence on certain sectors within food and agriculture. And I'll give you one, which is the alternative meat and dairy industry. And there are really three ways to think about this. One is to dress up plant proteins to look, smell, taste, feel, sizzle like meat. And I think there's a little bit of scar tissue on that subsector. The second is to get microorganisms, be they yeast or bacteria, to be mini bioreactors, do the job of transitioning, let's say, plant starches, carbohydrates into proteins. And we've seen, worked examples of that where yeast is now producing casein and whey, which are the components of milk. And the same yeasts are producing albumin, which is one of the compounds in eggs. It's the egg white. And it's quite remarkable technology, and I think is one that is requiring a lot of capital investment to become commercially viable. The one that we think is super interesting is where you're getting replication of cells. And, the postcursor of stem cells are myoblasts or fibroblasts producing meat or fat, respectively. And here in certain conditions, be it pressure, temperature, time, and with the right ingredients, you can actually make these cells replicate. And the end result is you're producing meat. It might be chicken or fish without killing a chicken or a fish. It's just replicating cells within a series of containments. And I think that's probably the game changer in this alternative meat and dairy business, and one that we're certainly backing very strongly. I think also certainly I'm given to believe that something like 63% of consumers are adopting a more sustainable choice when buying their food. And the rise of organic, you just have to walk into any of these retailers to see these categories and their positioning being very prominent. You look at the egg industry and look at the differentiation between, barn-reared, outdoor-reared, some combination of the both, non-caged. That kind of categorization and labeling, I think, is helping that industry through the maelstrom, which is the poor consumer left to try and figure out all this stuff.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
I think, the rise of the farm shop or going directly to farm is also consumer led, and so this health and wellness movement, I think, is very prominent and will continue.
Yeah. That's something that's noticeable in the community where I live in upstate New York. I mean, there's an army of consumers that come up to this part of New York State every weekend, and they do a lot of shopping at the farm stands and the stores. And of course, they have those kinds of retail outlets in the city as well, with companies like Whole Food and Trader Joe's, et cetera. But I agree with you. I think this movement is growing strongly. So what innovations are you especially excited about as investments in food and agriculture today? You've mentioned a couple already, but are there other examples that you can give our listeners?
Certainly. We've been doing this for close on 8 years, and we've invested in 34 companies across the globe. So we have a pretty interesting birdseat in looking at the industry. And one of the sectors that is really appealing to me at the moment is precision agriculture. And this is really the adoption of vision systems on farm. And as we know, the adoption of anything technological in food and agriculture has been sclerotic. It's been met with cynicism. It has been quite slow to happen. But in this case, we're seeing some really interesting companies, and I'll mention one, which is Eco Robotics. It's a Swiss company that has a boom that fits to any tractor, and a series of cameras, 2D, 3D vision cameras and sensors. And as the tractor goes along, it has these various nozzles attached, which are precision spraying nozzles. And it can go along and recognize green on green, which means that if you have a field of canola and you're looking for a certain weed, it can recognize that. And by doing so, and using an AI stack, which is essentially its knowledge bank, it gets better and better each pass along a field. Eventually, you find it being extremely accurate in the way it sprays, what it sprays, and the speed at which that spraying can happen. And today, this is a market leader. And on farm, it's recognized as being able to reduce herbicides, it might be glyphosate or Roundup as it's known, by something like 90%. And the cost savings to the farmer mean that the payback of this machine is something of the order of 3 to 4 months.
Wow, that's incredible.
So it's an extraordinarily appealing proposition, and one, again, that sort of speaks to the externalities that we've mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and I love anything with robotics. I mean, and AI combined. It seems like these are the kinds of technologies that we need more and more of in agriculture going forward. So, Rob, listen, this has been a great conversation. Would like to make sure that you send us or send us any links or documents that you would like to attach to this program, and tell our followers where online the Sustainable Finance podcast community can learn more about your team's work at Cibus Capital and how they can get in touch with you about the topics that we've discussed in today's episode.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. You can find us on our website, which is cibusfund.com. We are active on LinkedIn. We also have a venture newsletter speaking to the ag tech and food tech ideas that we're seeing and promoting, and in some cases declining. And we have, I think, one of the most well-articulated sustainability reports that has been published by anyone, which is the Cibus Annual Sustainability Report for last year, just published. And I'd offer that to anyone to see how we measure some of these situations, some of these externalities that we've been talking about, and how we're really trying to address the complexities of Scope 3 and X-Farm solutions, and providing insights and direction to farmers to get this right. So in all cases, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to speak to me, and I can direct to any one of our team.
And they can reach you, I'm assuming, by going online to your website and following the directions to do so. And you're right, I've briefly gone through your latest annual report, and it's chock full of information that anybody interested in this field will really appreciate, I think. So, Rob, thank you very much for joining us today on this episode. And for our followers, I'm Paul Ellis, and this is the Sustainable Finance Podcast.